Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and over the next 2 lectures we're going to be talking about the parables in our continuing study of the life of Christ. In his book Principles for Oral Narrative Research, Alex Ulrich gives several principles that I want to underscore. I love the way he said this. First of all is the law of opening and closing. That is, you look at a book, or a story in this case, you look at a story and you see how it starts and how it ends. Now, what's in the middle is important too, but give it special attention to the opening and the closing of the story. Folk narrative does not usually begin with sudden action, and it does not normally end abruptly. In other words, the story ends nicely, and the story begins, there's a little bit of an introduction to it. And when you do see those sorts of things, when there is a sudden end, it's there for a reason. So take special note. But there's the law of opening and closing. Secondly, the law of repetition. Let me say that again. The law of repetition. Let me say it one more time. The law of repetition. Events are repeated. Often they are repeated 3 times. That's very commonplace in oral stories. We do it the same way when we're telling jokes. We'll tell a joke and something will happen, and then the same thing will happen with maybe a couple of different variations, and then a third time. And we do that for a variety of reasons. One is to build up suspense, or another is to have it something with which to compare. But events are often repeated, and often 3 times. Thirdly, the law of 3. Not only do events get repeated, but there's all sorts of things that come in sets of 3. That's very commonplace in oral narrative stories. Finally, the law of 2 to a scene. Even though things come in 3s, each scene usually has only 2 speaking characters. For example, let's take the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and there's the rich man and there's Lazarus, but also there's the Lord. But only 2 are speaking at any given time. The dialogue isn't a 3-way dialogue. It's only given with 2 people speaking at the same time. Or take the story of the prodigal son. There's the younger brother, the older brother, and the father, and they all have speaking parts. But only 2 are speaking at a time. There's the father speaking to the younger brother, or there's the father speaking to the older brother, but you don't have all 3 speaking at the same time. In such stories, the youngest son, or the youngest individual, will have our sympathy. And the last thing that is going to be said, the last test as it were, will be decisive. So that's a little countercultural. Remember that in that culture, the older got the inheritance, but that doesn't mean he necessarily gets the sympathy. And maybe there's something there that's tuned into the ancient culture that comes from the very heart of the Lord. Well, 3 kinds of parables that we will be looking at. First of all, there is the riddle parable. This is the parable that sets forth a riddle, sets forth a question. It has to be untangled. It's meant to hide the truth from the unknowing, and it will continue to be hidden from them. On the other hand, for those who are in the know, sometimes they actually have to have an explanation that's given. But the riddle parable is meant to hide the truth. Next, there's the example parable. The example parable tells us a story, and we are to learn from that example. We're to either go and do likewise, or go and not do likewise, but we're to learn from the example. And then thirdly are the challenge parables. It sets forth a challenge. It challenges us to think, to discuss, to argue, to wrestle with whatever truth is being presented. All right. The parables are introduced, at least Luke's version, and remember it will be in Luke that we see all of the longer story parables. Now, we've seen parables already in Matthew chapter 13 and in Mark's synoptic account, but I'm entitling this lecture and the next one the parables, because we're going to be looking at the longer story parables, and they are exclusive to Luke's account. So Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 53, this is the pivotal point in the entire Gospel of Luke. When the days were approaching for his ascension, that is Jesus, he's going to be going to Jerusalem, he's going to be lifted up on the cross, and then he'll death, burial, resurrection, ascended into heaven. As the days for all that are approaching, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead of him. And they went and entered. Now he's up in Galilee, and he's headed toward Jerusalem. But to get from Jerusalem, or from Galilee to Jerusalem, you have to go through Samaria, or you have to make a big detour around it. In this case, he sends messengers on ahead, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. But they, those Samaritans, did not receive him, because he was traveling toward Jerusalem, and they didn't like people who went to Jerusalem. They didn't like the Jews. They didn't like anything to do with Jerusalem. And Jesus was going to Jerusalem, and so notice he is rejected in this case even by the Samaritans. When his disciples, James and John, they're going to get a nickname from this, when they saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? You know, you give the command and we'll command it, and we'll watch the fireworks begin." But he turned and rebuked them and said, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went on to another village. As we said, I think perhaps this is where their nickname comes from. We're going to see that they have the nickname later on, Sons of Thunder. Maybe they wanted to be Sons of Thunder, and I don't know if that's where it comes from. But Jesus says, no, I'm not here for that purpose. I'm not here to destroy. I'm here to save. And so he turns from that village to go into another village. Now, we have in Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, the 12 are sent out. But when we get to Luke chapter 10, after that pivotal point, we have another sending forth. This isn't the same sending, because Luke mentions both of them. This is the sending out of the 70. In chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, we have the names of the 12 apostles given. There are no names of who the 70 are. We don't know any of them. In the case of the 12, they had been sent out throughout Galilee. In the case of the 70, they are sent out as forerunners of Jesus to wherever he might be going. And we just read, he's going through Samaria, so it might include that. In Luke chapter 9, we had the 12 going, and their sending forth concludes the ministry of Jesus in Galilee, at least insofar as Luke is presenting that. In Luke chapter 10, with the 70 being sent out, this introduces the movement toward Jerusalem. In Luke chapter 9, with the sending out of the 12, they are sent only to Jews, not to Samaritans, not to the Gentiles. But in this sending forth, where the 70 are sent out, it seems to include, at least from Luke's account, places where there's both Jews and Gentiles and Samaritans, and even places where non-kosher food might be served. Even places like that. So, given that, we now have a parable that's going to be given. Luke chapter 10. And it will be part of a larger account. You see, the passage begins, Luke chapter 10, verse 25, with a legal question. And the question comes, someone comes and asks Jesus, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" What do you have to do to be saved? And Jesus says, well, you know the law. Obey God and love God and love men. And, love God and the Father with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And your neighbor as yourself. And so the questioner, and maybe he's looking for a loophole, he asks the question, who is my neighbor? Who do I have to love? There's only one God. We know who God is. But in this context where you are sending people out not just to Israel, but to places where there might be Samaritans and even those nasty old Gentiles, who is my neighbor? How far do I have to go with that sort of love? And so then I have the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which a man is going, remember, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, but here's somebody going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and that's probably the more dangerous part of the road. That's a very lonely road, the 18 miles going from Jerusalem downhill all the way to Jericho. And in the story, the man who is traveling is set upon by robbers, and he is beaten and left almost dead. And someone comes along, and there's a priest who comes along, and then a scribe, a priest and a scribe. And they don't stop by. They continue on their way for whatever reason. We're not told why. We can probably guess and things like that, but that's not helpful, and it's not germane to the story. But then a Samaritan comes, and the Samaritan gets down off his donkey and helps the man. Now, we're not told what nationality the man was, presumably Jewish, because that's who's usually going from Jericho or from Jerusalem to Jericho, and helps him and takes him to an inn and pays for his lodging and his support and his well-being, and offers to pay any overage that's left over, and then goes on his way. And the question then is asked, who acted like a neighbor? Who acted the part of a neighbor? Who loved his neighbor as himself? And of course the answer is the Samaritan. And Jesus sees that as something that's an example of what you ought to do and how you love your neighbor. So that's the story and the lesson from the story. But then we have a second story. And this is not a parable. Well, I guess we could call it a living story, because this is going to be the story of Mary and Martha. Now, this isn't just told as a parable. This actually happens. Jesus goes to their house, and Martha is preparing the meal, and Mary is listening to Jesus, and Martha goes and asks a question. Notice we have a story and a question. And the question is, Lord, have you seen what Mary is doing? She's not helping in the kitchen. What do you think about this? And again, there is a resulting instruction, a resulting evaluation. Mary has chosen the better part. So, remember, we started off, this was love God and love your neighbor. That's the command. And then that led to the parable of the Good Samaritan, explaining on how to love your neighbor. And then the story of Mary and Martha aren't dealing with how to love your neighbor, but it's going back, the story of Mary and Martha are going back and illustrating on how to love God. So both parts of that initial command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, both those are illustrated first in the parable of the Good Samaritan and then in the story of Mary and Martha. So, he told them a parable. Here's the next parable. He told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Here's somebody, his business is booming, and it's booming to the point where he's got more crops than he has places to put them. And then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. I'm going to expand my holdings. Verse 19, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. It's time to retire and enjoy all for which I have worked. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. If you're going to be rich in the right place. Be rich in the place that counts. Be rich toward God, not just toward your bank account. Because being rich toward your bank account is rather shallow. It's rather temporary. You cannot take it with you. I've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. You can't take it with you. But you can store it with the one who will be there waiting for you in the end. All right, let's talk about living in readiness, because that last parable sort of takes us there. But now Jesus goes on to say, be dressed in readiness and keep your lamps lit. Be ready for what? Well, be ready for whatever comes your way. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. You have a master, and there's going to be coming a day when he returns, and you better be ready to meet him, because he will return at a time you do not know. Blessed are those slaves whom the master will find on the alert when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will gird himself to serve. Notice the master is going to become the servant for those servants who are serving the master. And he will gird himself to serve and have them recline at the table, and will come up and wait on them. But they have to be ready. They have to be, if they have been a faithful servant, then he will serve the servants. Verse 38, whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But you don't know when he's coming. And so we are called to live lives of readiness, and we do that by serving him faithfully in the interim. Be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming. Now, we're changing our metaphors a little bit. Before we had a master who's coming, and of course that represents Jesus. Here we have a thief that's coming, and it still represents Jesus, not the fact that he's stealing anything, but the fact that a thief comes unexpectedly, and Jesus is going to come unexpectedly, and you don't know when he's coming. When a thief comes, he doesn't call up your house and he doesn't say, look, I'll be by your house to rob it at 3 a.m, can you please leave out milk and cookies? He doesn't tell you, he doesn't announce his coming, he doesn't say when it's going to be. And if the head of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. You two be ready. That's the point. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. You be ready for his coming. You be living a faithful life so that you are always ready. Now, verses 35 through 38, we have the example of the watchful slaves waiting for the coming of the Messiah from the wedding feast. That's a joyful occasion. They don't know when he's coming, so they're ready. And now what we've seen in verses 39 and 40 is the watchful head of the house waiting for the coming of the thief. This is a sorrowful occasion. But notice in both cases, you don't know when he's coming. The head of the house doesn't know when the thief is coming. The slaves did not know when the master is coming. You don't know when Jesus is coming, and so be ready at all times. Now, Peter says, he has to ask, Lord, are you addressing this parable to us or to everyone else as well? Is this one of those parables that applies just to the disciples? Or does this apply to everyone? That's a great question, isn't it? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and sensible steward, whom his master will put in charge of his servants to give them their rations at the proper time? You see, notice how Jesus answers that. Is it, Peter says, is it just us? Is it just me? Is it just us? And Jesus answers his question with a question. Who is the one who's faithful? Does that describe you? If it does, then this parable is for you. If you are one of God's faithful people, it is a parable for you. And if that doesn't describe you, then the parable isn't for you. Verse 43, blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. You get to answer whether the parable is for you or not. Where is your heart? Where is your readiness to receive the master? But if that slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to beat the slaves, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk. In other words, here's a slave that's not waiting for his master. Verse 46, the master's still going to come. The master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour when he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. What kind of servant are you? And that determines your reception at the hands of the master. And that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will, by the way, that's you right now, because you've already heard what is his will. If you knew his will and didn't get ready for his will, if you did not act in accordance with his will, then you will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of flogging will receive but few. There's a point to be made here. The more you are given, the more for which you are accountable. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required. And to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. That is a sobering thought. And I do not say this to have you turn away from the truth. It's too late for that. You've already heard the truth. But now you are called to be responsible for that truth which you have been given. So I have the faithful steward versus the unfaithful steward. The faithful steward follows the instructions of the master. The unfaithful steward, well, there was the one who knew the master's will but did not follow it, and then there's also the one who did not know the master's will. And in both cases they are responsible, but the one who knew the master's will has a higher level of responsibility. Now the faithful steward, he's put in charge of all the master's possessions. But the unfaithful steward, the one who he knew the master's will but did not follow it, he will receive many lashes. And the one who did not know the master's will, well, he receives lashes too, but not quite as many. To whom much is given, much is required. I have come, Jesus says, to cast fire upon the earth. Now, remember we were reading back in Luke chapter 10, where James and John were saying, shall we bring fire down on the earth? No. I'm not here for that right now. But there is a sense in which I've come to cast fire upon the earth. Not in the way they wanted, not this immediate thing. And he says, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it is accomplished. See, there's an order of events. Yes, there will eventually be fire upon the earth, but first there's a baptism. Before the fire, there's water. And this isn't a water baptism, but it's a identification with the death and with the cross of Christ. I have a baptism to undergo. And he's looking at that in the near future. Verse 49, I've come to cast fire upon the earth, and how I wish it was kindled. Verse 50, I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it is accomplished. The fire represents the judgment of God. The baptism also represents the judgment of God, but more specifically, it represents Jesus' identification with that judgment that he will take, with which he will be baptized, that he will drink, that he will suffer in our place. All right, Luke chapter 13. This chapter opens with a question. There had been a situation where there had been some political unrest, and Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, precept, the fellow in charge, had brought about an action where some people had been killed. People who had gone to the temple to worship instead had found themselves being put to death. And the question is about those who died in those circumstances. And they asked Jesus, what about that? What about that? And Jesus says, do you think that the ones who died were more wicked than anybody else? Or, takes another example, a tower had fallen, squished some people. Do you think those people who died were more wicked than anyone else? And the answer is, unless you repent, you will also perish. And this leads us to a parable. A parable in verses 6 through 9 is the parable of the fig tree. The tree that it's a fig tree, so it's supposed to grow figs, and it doesn't. And because it doesn't, the master of the tree says, well, cut it down. Well, here, maybe we can fertilize it and prune it and, sort of coerce the fruit. That's fine, but if it still doesn't come, cut it down, because fruitfulness is required. It is not an option. That's the parable of the fig tree. And now, in verses 10 through 13, Jesus heals a woman, and he does so on the Sabbath day. And as we first look at these three events, they don't seem to bear a lot of relationship, but I think as we continue, there will be. He next rebukes a synagogue official for his heart lacking in compassion, for his Sabbath legalism. He says, look, even if your donkey had fallen into a pit, you would do something about it. And you are upset because a woman was healed on the Sabbath? What's wrong with you? There is lacking in your heart a certain fruit of the kingdom, the fruit of compassion. And he rebukes this religious leader. And that brings us to two parables. The two parables of the kingdom, a seed that grows up and turns into a tree, sort of reminds me a little bit of the fig tree. And it just takes you don't plant a tree to get a tree. You plant a little seed and it grows up into a tree. It becomes fruitful. And you take a little leaven and you put it into a loaf, and it leavens the entire loaf of bread. A little turns into a lot. It is fruitful. And now this brings a second question. Are only a few going to be saved? And the answer, is that might be the case. And if it is, then you make sure that you're one who is saved. If it is only going to be a few who are saved, then make sure you're one of those few. Turn to the Lord. Trust in him. Repent. Seek him with all your mind and soul and heart. Now, next we come to some party parables. Party parables. It just sounds like we're going to have fun. It happened that when he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees, and he goes on the Sabbath day, this is Luke chapter 14, verse 1, to eat bread, they were watching him closely, because by this time we are used to see Jesus doing rather non-traditional things on the traditional Sabbath day. And it's not that he's breaking the Sabbath, he's just keeping the Sabbath in a way that they didn't really get. And there in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, religious lawyers, not the kind we think about today. And he asked them a question: is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they don't answer him. Because every time they do, they always stick their foot in it. And I think they're getting to the point where they understand that. And they keep silent. And he took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well and not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath? You see, their thinking had been, the official interpretation was you're only supposed to heal if it's saving their life. Well, wait a minute. If your ox fell into a well, it could probably stay there, or your son. Technically, it could stay there until tomorrow, but no, you'd pull him out. Here's somebody that I made well. And humanly speaking, didn't look like it took a whole lot of effort. They didn't have to get ropes. He just made him well. And they had no reply to this. They could make no reply to such a point. And he began speaking a parable to the invited guests. Now notice this is going to be a dinner theme. He began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out the places of honor at the table. Everybody was sort of jockeying for the best seat as opposed to the not so best seat. And he says to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, now this wasn't a wedding feast, this was just a feast, but when you're invited to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both will come, and he invited both of you, he'll come and say to you, give your place to this man, and then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher, and then you'll have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbled himself will be exalted. But that's not just talking about going to parties. It's a lesson. It is a party lesson, but it's a party lesson about a bigger party. It's a party lesson about the kingdom of heaven that is itself described in party terms. You see, it's talking about, are you going to be proud or are you going to be humbled before the Lord? And he's speaking to religious leaders, to Pharisees, to professional religious do-gooders who have a history of pride. And that is a way to find that you need a lesson in humility. He also went on to say, now he's just talked to those that were invited, now he's going to talk to the one who invited him to this party. He also went on to say to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, otherwise they also may invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Don't merely do good to those who can do good back to you. Do not merely do good to, doesn't mean you have to be mean to them, but don't do good just to those who can pay you back, who can boost your name before others, who can help you go forward, who can move you along socially or physically or financially or other ways. Do good to those who can't help you at all, so that the Lord can be your repayment at the resurrection of the righteous. When one of those who were reclining at the table, okay, notice we're still at the table, and Jesus has spoken to the guests. He's spoken to the one who invited him, the host, and now one of the guests, one of those who were reclining at the table with him, heard this. He said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Sounds very pious. I guess he wanted to say something spiritual, and this is what comes to mind. But he said to him, and Jesus is going to use that as an opportunity to tell a story. Here's the story. A man was giving a big dinner, and he invited many. And at the dinner hour he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is ready now." But they all alike began to make excuses. The first one said to him, "I bought a piece of land. I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused." Another one said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. please consider me excused. Another one said, I've married a wife, and for that reason I can't come. There's always a reason. People always have a reason they don't come to Jesus. And no reason is a good one. Well, the slave came back and reported this to his master, and the head of the household became angry and said to his slave, Go out at once into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring them in here, the poor and crippled and blind and lame. Say, I invited the worthy, they didn't come, now go out and get the unworthy, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And the slave said, Master, what you commanded has already been done, and we still have room. And so the master now goes, to the slave, go out not just into the city, but now go out into the highways and along the hedges, and compel them to come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you that none of those men who were invited shall taste of my dinner. Now, how do we apply that? Here Jesus is telling this parable in the home of a Pharisee, one of the honored guests, one of the honored invitees or invitors. And for the invitation to his kingdom, there's always an excuse. And so he goes out and he gives the same invitation to the poor, the blind, the lame, both physically as well as spiritually. In fact, I think perhaps especially those who spiritually are poor in spirit, those who spiritually are mourning over their condition, those who spiritually are blind and lame and lost and know it. And still there's room. And so Jesus is going to instruct his slave and his followers and his evangelists to go not just to the Jews, but out into the highways, the hedges, the byways, the nations, and compel them to come in. So that the kingdom will not be limited to the house of Israel, but it will include all the world. Have you trusted in him? Have you come to him? Have you accepted his invitation?